subscribe.
First, just a few weeks before he died in February this year, the great train robber Bruce Reynolds gave one final interview to the crime novelist Jake Arnott. He revealed new details about the crime that he described as his Sistine Chapel and provided a final perspective on the massive police hunt that followed. But as Jake Arnott now recalls in this week's Archive on 4, the mythology of the great train robbery has worn off and the folk heroes are fading. The crime of the century.
Whatever happened to them all after the brouhaha was over? The villains, their families, the witnesses, even the police. Whatever happened to the men who went in blanket hoods to court and in handcuffs to prison? Whatever happened to the money that was stolen? £2,631,084. Many people still seem to want to remember the great train robbery, to have personal association with it.
Today, the 20th day in the hunt for the mail train robbers.
The great train robbery took place less than 4 years ago.
15 years ago, a gang of thieves stole 2.5...
25 years ago today, a gang of armed men.
30 years ago this weekend, a train was robbed.
Clearly, 30 years on, this is one robbery that remains as great as ever.
It is 40 years since the great train robbery, the biggest and most audacious.
Whether we like it or not, the great train robbery has become a legend.
Well, it's now 50 years since the great train robbery. It could be the last big anniversary that will be commemorated, but don't count on it. At 3 a.m. on the 8th of August 1963, the night mail train from Glasgow to London was stopped in Buckinghamshire by a gang of thieves. They broke into the high-value package coach and made off with 120 mail bags stuffed with used banknotes. Their haul was over £2.5 million, something in the region of 40 million in today's money. And although there have been bigger heists since, the great train robbery still occupies a significant place in the British psyche. The robbery and its aftermath spins an intriguing tale that is part social history, part cultural mythology. The great train robbers were seen by some as ruthless and violent, self-serving thugs. To others, they're folk heroes, latter-day Robin Hoods, liberating some excess cash from the Bank of England. At the heart of the story is a powerful juxtaposition. A group of working-class guys making a raid on the establishment, just as the 60s social revolution was ready to explode. Bruce Reynolds was the stylish villain that led the train robbers.
My first taste of prison was one with Scrubs. I think I cried myself to sleep that night, thinking I'll never do it again.
I first met Bruce 13 years ago at a book launch. I was struck then by his eloquence and panache, despite his notoriety. I spoke with him just a month before he passed away. Even at the age of 81, Bruce still seemed an impressive figure. This was his last recorded interview. Bruce was in and out of prison. Small robberies led to bigger robberies.
Of the flying squad at Scotland Yard.
So there were more opportunities for crime back then, do you think?
Well, I think there were probably more opportunities, but crime was at a lower level. I mean, the number of really serious robberies were quite low. I mean, the ones that sort of come to mind were the post office raid in East Castle Street in Marylebone, and the two major criminals that were known on everybody's lips were Jack Spot and Billy Hill.
Warren Street, just off the Tottenham Court Road, was really the street of opportunity.
Do you feel that this was a time where there was a sort of transition into becoming a professional thief?
Yeah. It was almost like the Pope acknowledging you to walk down Warren Street to be greeted by Billy Hill. That's when I knew I'd arrived.
In the Royal Hall, Harrogate, there's no doubt that something is happening in the world of men's fashions. Get the general idea? Don't be afraid of something new.
And of course, if you had a good suit on and looked the part, as has been said of me in the past on wanted posters, could be mistaken for a gentleman.
The mink collar is detachable, and you know that's a very good thing. And to make absolutely sure that it's safe, use the double security thief-proof lock.
That was exactly the effect I wanted.
What they wanted to do was to buy fast cars. They wanted to live in the south of France. They wanted to be at the gaming tables. They wanted to smoke cigars. They really wanted to live the good life.
Laurie Taylor. In the 70s, Laurie would meet Bruce during his time teaching sociology classes in the maximum security E-wing of Durham Prison, where he found that they had mutual interests.
Bruce was always charming and polite and, I don't know, it sounds an odd thing to say, but sort of like well-spoken in a way. He almost paraded himself as someone, Laurie, I'm sorry you're amongst all this detritus in the room here at the moment, all these rather common criminals, but I understand where you're coming from. I like modern jazz rather like you. I'm into Dave Brubeck, and I suspect if we were out, we'd have rather a good time at the gaming tables in Cannes. You know, Bruce was always rather like that. I felt an instant connection with him. I remember being told by the governor, don't be taken in by all that suave charm, Laurie. I was a bit.
It's now described as the swinging 60s. Did you feel that you were kind of part of that?
Everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. People seemed to have money for the first time. People were just beginning to dine out when people would talk about going to this restaurant and that restaurant.
At 6 o'clock precisely, this tea shop turns itself, hey presto, into a chic French restaurant.
It was a time of great experiments. I mean, things like rotisserie chickens came out, which was, you know, a total novelty. It was a zeitgeist. Things were really sort of buzzing, and I'd now got sort of money to spend and the ambition to get more.
This was one of the most daring and vicious wages snatches carried out for a very long time. Its story is both fascinating and disturbing.
It was in November 1962 that Bruce and some fellow professional criminals who would later participate in the Great Train Robbery committed an audacious robbery at Heathrow Airport. It was quickly dubbed the City Gents Raid because the robbers had disguised themselves with dark suits, neat overcoats and bowler hats.
Some of them had stocking masks. They were very vicious. One man rushed at me while I was fighting this man off. Another man covered me at the back.
You'd have to say that it was a violent robbery, the airport robbery. But you know, that's what we did. And there's no excuses.
The City Gents had expected 400 grand, only got 62,000. Not quite enough to retire on. Nonetheless, they got away with it.
A brilliant breaking of the bank. A quite unlosable game.
Bruce Reynolds' 1963 had begun elegantly in the south of France.
Whereas most of the others had been sort of hiding away in the back streets of Camberwell. Some of them had even stood trial for the airport robbery and not been convicted. Immediately I got in touch with my friends, Gordon Goody, Buster Edwards, Charlie Wilson. We virtually just had a quiet evening, kicking around what could be done. It started out originally, I think, with something that Billy Hill had said. The future of major robberies is in railways. Virtually out of the blue, within a couple of days, Gordon had been in touch with Brian Fields, a lawyer that had hacked him for him, who said to them he had information about the mail train that left Glasgow for London every night, and it carried money. We all sort of said, well, do you think it can be done? And, you know, I said, yeah, you know, let's go to work on it straight away. This was the big one I could afford to retire.
The gang's target was the Glasgow to Euston Royal Mail train, specifically the high-value packages coach that carried money, usually in the region of £300,000. With their inside information, the robbers learned that there would be even more money on the train after a bank holiday weekend. Buster Edwards knew of someone he thought could stop a train. The problem was that he was a member of another firm. A meeting was arranged with Roger Caudry, an electronics expert, who only agreed to be part of the job if his firm could be involved.
How big a part did Bruce Reynolds and Charlie Wilson have in this planning? very, very big. Without them two, there wouldn't have been a train robbed.
Were you the mastermind of this operation?
I was the energy behind it, the motivating force. I'd done more work than absolutely anyone else. I was swanking, let's say. I mean, I was Bruce Reynolds, who'd evaded capture. I was driving a Lotus Cortina, which was like a rarity at the time. And I was dressing the part. I mean, I was dressing a la Ian Fleming with bow ties, polka dot bow ties, and say suits by Kilgore French and Stanbury. Shoes by Lobbs. Of course I was playing the part right up to the hill. I suppose I was acting the part.
Various roles were assigned. Ex-Formula One racer Roy James, who'd worked as a getaway driver, was put in charge of transport and figuring out how to uncouple the high-value packages coach from the rest of the train. James would get plenty of practice on the Royal Mail train yards in London.
Well, we dressed up as actual railway workers with the long iron bar which they used for tapping the lines, and away we went. We even actually used their canteen.
Bruce was scouting out where they could stop the train.
The exact place we found virtually straight away.
Lorry could be loaded from here, and it's near enough to London.
Gordon Goody.
The only thing that did worry us was the fact that most London thieves, they don't like working out of London, and it's a superstition, but nothing more, you know.
What's the superstition? You're going to get caught?
You're going to get nicked, yeah.
By June 1963, a team of 14 men were going to tackle the train. By chance, Bruce Reynolds visited a friend who had recently met a retired train driver. Bruce offers his friend a part in the job if he could bring the driver along. It was a relatively minor role. Thus, another player enters the story. I've come to a care home in North London to meet with Ronald Arthur Biggs, the most famous or maybe infamous of the train robbers, mostly because of the time he spent on the run as a fugitive from justice. I'm here with Ron and Chris Pickard, who's a friend and ghostwriter.
One of the side effects Ron had from his various strokes, where it doesn't affect his mobility at all, unfortunately, is his speaking and his voice went. So he had to learn to communicate other ways, and he came up with the best method is a spelling board, which is just plastic-covered paper with the alphabet on it.
It seems from all accounts of your involvement in the robbery that it came by chance. Was that lucky or unlucky, do you think? U-N-L. So you think it was you were unlucky, yeah? If you could go back in time, and if you were at the moment when Bruce Reynolds asked you if you wanted to be involved in this, what would you say? Would you say yes or no? Yes. You'd still have said yes. At 3 a.m. on August the 8th, 1963, coincidentally Ronnie Biggs' 34th birthday, the gang hid along the tracks in Cheddington, Buckinghamshire. The man that had rigged up the track signals to indicate the train had to stop was Roger Caudry.
Well, I placed a glove over the green bulb and connected batteries to the red bulb.
Just like that, and it stopped?
Well, the train slowed down at the orange signal and drew up to us very slowly and stopped at the red signal.
Meanwhile, several of the robbers climbed into the locomotive. The driver of the train, Jack Mills, not knowing how many robbers there were, fought with the intruders. He was coshed over the head with an iron bar.
I sank to my knees. The next thing I remember, I was on my knees on the floor.
Gordon Goody.
I was on the driver's side of the cab and could hear a commotion going on inside, and climbed up in, and I saw Mills fighting with somebody on the other side. So I grabbed hold of him and threw him on the floor. And afterwards, he put him in the chair, and he had some blood on his face and that sort of thing, you know.
In the cab, the man that Ronnie Biggs had brought along, nicknamed Stan, was unable to get the train moving.
I was told to get in my driving seat, take the train forward and not look up. And we should shout stop. And you must stop, or else you get some more.
Bruce Reynolds was waiting at Briddigo Bridge.
We waited while we saw silhouetted against the night sky. The train heard all the clankings that were going on while it was being uncoupled. And finally, very, very slowly but inexorably, it pulled away from the rest of the train, the loco and 2 carriages, and with that we drove to the next stop, which was Briddigone Bridge, and there the assault took place.
The robbers unloaded 120 sacks by forming a human chain to 2 waiting Land Rovers. They then sped off to their hideout, Leatherslade Farm. The whole operation took about half an hour. Gordon Goody.
We had high-frequency radios, and Bobby and I were monitoring the police calls. So I happened to hear 2 police officers conversing. And one said to the other one, he says, "You're not going to believe this," he said, "but somebody's just stolen the train."
The gang emptied the mail bags to discover their haul. Over £2.5 million. Ronnie Biggs, here interviewed in 1999.
And Charlie Wilson was dancing the twist and saying, "I like it, I like it." Gordon Goody was singing
the British way that everyone gets equal shares, so everyone got £150,000 each.
The alarm was raised by one of the railwaymen at 4:30 a.m. When it became clear what had happened, Scotland Yard and the national media went into action and headed up to Buckinghamshire. Over breakfast, Britain first heard the news that an extraordinary theft of unprecedented amounts of money had taken place.
The engine and the front 2 coaches of the mail train have been brought back here to Cheddington Station to be examined yet again by men from the Police Forensic Science Laboratory.
Reginald Abbis was the BBC reporter that would cover the story right through.
There in the new headquarters of the Buckinghamshire Constabulary, they're collating the evidence and information that is coming in.
Reports on the amount of money stolen quickly escalated.
£1 million. Biggest ever mail robbery.
Headlined the London Evening Standard.
It may top £2.5 million.
Shouted the Daily Express the following day. The press had 5 field days to fill with speculation when it seemed that the police didn't have any major clues. However, there soon would be plenty to report.
That was on Tuesday the 13th of August when my sergeant phoned me up at home and asked me did I know where Leatherslade Farm was in Brill. My name's John Woolley, and at the time of the Great Train Robbery I was a recently appointed village policeman at Brill, a sleepy little village really.
John Woolley was instrumental in making the most important breakthrough for the investigation. A local farm worker had become suspicious of some activities at a supposedly empty farmhouse. John was sent to investigate Leatherslade Farm.
Light coming in gave me immediate signs of occupation.
Even 50 years on, John remembers entering that farmhouse as if it were yesterday.
I found a trapdoor in an alcove off the kitchen area, and lifting that trapdoor I could see that it was steps leading down, quite obviously down into the cellar. I could see that that cellar was absolutely full of bulging sacks, all lined up along the walls of the cellar, piled one on top of the other. I realised that what I'd got hold of wasn't a corn sack, wasn't a potato sack, as I'd perhaps half expected it might be. It was, in fact, a canvas mail bag, and as the top flopped open, I could see parcel wrappers, banknote wrappers, consignment notes. We found the train robbers' hideout.
The robbers had arranged that the farm would be cleaned up or burnt down after they left on Friday the 9th of August. Unfortunately for them, that didn't happen. The media coverage and police uproar had scared off the men assigned to the job.
Once the money had been shared at the farm, that was the end of the train robbery as far as I was concerned. I rang up someone to find out if the farm had been cleared out, and they said it hadn't. So we had a meeting, me, Buster, Gordon and John, and while we were talking about it, someone come in with a newspaper and we saw the headline that the farm had been discovered.
The police are hoping to learn a great deal today about this old farmhouse. Detective Superintendent Gerald MacArthur of Scotland Yard said they'd found a cellar which had produced something interesting, but they weren't saying what. And he said that just about anything and everything they find in the farmhouse could prove helpful.
So, you know, then it was like, goodbye chaps, you know, I don't know if we'll ever meet again. and I knew then I was going to have to go into hiding. It was definitely the dangerous hours.
The public were fascinated by every detail of the chase. The engine driver had been hit and seriously injured, but the raid was widely regarded as a crime against property, and therefore not as nasty as a crime against people.
The world was ready to talk about the great train robbery as an act of a radical gesture, if you like.
Laurie Taylor.
After all, they were only old banknotes, and after all, they were insured, so why not pass the money around a few people?
The robbery also struck a chord with the new aspirational age of the 1960s.
Rachel, where do you think the money is? 2.25 million of it's still missing. Where do you think that is now?
Well, I think, and this is only an assumption, of course, I think it's in convenient little bundles, perhaps 50,000 or £100,000 bundles, and a good many people know where that money is.
Mrs. Hargrave, being, as she describes herself, a bit of a fidget, strolled off through the woods.
Just 8 days after the robbery came this startling discovery in Dorking Woods.
And there, placed in a small depression not 100 yards from the road, were 3 cases. Inside was just over £100,000 in banknotes.
What have you done with your reward?
Well, I bought myself a very nice fur coat, for one thing. I had a beaver lamb, and I bought another type.
A couple of months later, £50,000 were found in a phone box in South London.
There was those great wads of notes, and the idea there were millions and millions of pounds in suitcases, in garages, and banknotes, and being left in telephone boxes. This was the part of the wondrous comic glory of the entire episode.
And do you think that's what captured the imagination, because it appealed to that sense within all of us, really, of wanting to salivating over all that cash?
It appeals to the idea, all of us, of having a suitcase full of £5 notes underneath our bed.
How's the hunt for the mail robbers going? Well, I wouldn't ask anybody at Aylesbury. Nobody seems to know anything at the search headquarters. A complete stop on all information was thrown over police inquiries today. Nobody knows what's happening here at all.
On top of the scale of the haul and the sheer audacity of the robbers, the police authorities, at least initially, didn't seem to be anywhere closer to catching a group of unknown master criminals. It was perfect fodder for the anti-establishment comedians of Beyond the Fringe.
The great train robbery of over £3 million continues to baffle the British police.
Good evening.
However, we have here with us in the studio this evening the Deputy Head of New Scotland Yard, Arthur Gappy.
Good evening.
And who do you think is behind the criminals?
We are considerably many days, indeed months and years behind.
Who do you think may have perpetrated this awful crime?
We believe this to be the work of thieves. And I'll tell you why. The whole pattern is extremely reminiscent of past robberies where we have found thieves to be involved.
The attitude of the public in those days, it was quite rebellious in many ways.
John O'Connor, former head of the flying squad.
People certainly were quite pleased when the establishment got a bloody nose. And that's understandable because there was a lot of poverty about. So I'm not surprised that they were looking for working class heroes to look up to.
The man in charge of the police investigation was legendary head of the flying squad, Tommy Butler.
He was a loner, was Tommy Butler, never married, and still lived with his mother, even in his 50s. A rather sharp-faced man, a sinister-looking man in some ways. I wouldn't like to have been across the table being interrogated by him. He was a workaholic who would work all the hours that he could stay awake, and he expected his men to do the same, and most of these fellows had families and homes to go to.
Besides being obsessive and tenacious, Butler was also very savvy. Like most professional detectives of the day, he was well acquainted with the criminal underworld. Laurie Taylor.
The police were implicated in this. It wasn't just the villains in one community. It was the police who were also engaged in all sorts of deals with this villainous community, operating together. So from time to time, the police would come along and say, we need someone for this job. They'd put someone up for the job. His name would go in for it. So the number of contacts that went on between the police and these villains here were two very solid, settled communities getting on really rather well with each other.
Later successor to Tommy Butler, John O'Connor.
There were significant numbers of officers who had good contacts in the underworld. Maybe in some ways it was a bit too close.
It's something that Gordon Goody made an accusation that Tommy Butler knew straight away who must have done the train robbery, because there was only a handful of people who were capable of such a thing, and so he just had to set about proving it was them. Do you think that Butler and the flying squad wanted the robbers so badly that there could have been any chance of a fit-up?
Is it possible? Yes, it's possible. Is it likely? No, it's not likely, because of the number of people that would have to be involved in it. And you're talking here not just about police officers, you're talking about forensic scientists, fingerprint people, and so forth. And once you're into the realms of a case that's so serious, that's got such worldwide publicity, I think any police officer trying to tamper with evidence is virtually going to be committing professional suicide. So I think that it is possible, but it's unlikely.
Charlie Wilson was the first robber to be taken in for questioning.
Detective Chief Superintendent Butler of Scotland Yard told the court that when charged, Wilson said, "I don't see how you can make it stick without the poppy, money, and you won't find that."
A month after the robbery, Ronnie Biggs was arrested.
It was late this afternoon when Ronald Arthur Biggs, a 34-year-old builder of Red Hill, Surrey, his head covered by the now familiar grey blanket, was brought into the tiny courthouse here at Linslade.
2 months later, Roy James was caught after a rooftop chase.
After being arrested in St John's Wood in London last night, James, who has grown a beard, was taken to Scotland Yard, where he was interviewed by detectives leading investigations into the mail train case.
By the end of 1963, 11 alleged members of the gang were in custody. Their trial began on the 20th of January 1964 in Aylesbury, Buckinghamshire.
So far, the court has heard 181 witnesses and has seen 481 exhibits, including boiler suits, balaclava helmets, mailbags and banknotes.
There were so many lawyers there. There were something like 25 lawyers with Queen's Counsel and juniors and others in the place, a lot of journalists, a lot of police officers and so on for the security, and they had to rent the Rural District Council offices. Very modern, they had to build a dock and a big press bench, and every morning when the judge would take his seat, the robbers were brought in, and they seemed to be, a pretty pleasant bunch of guys.
This pleasant bunch of guys faced serious charges. The coshing of Jack Mills was highlighted during the trial to demonstrate the severity of the crime. What do you feel about what happened to Jack Mills?
I feel very badly about what happened to Jack Mills. It was a mistake. I wasn't there at the actual spot. I was up the track when the assault took place. To this day, I don't know who actually hit Mills on the head, but I will say this, that Jack Mills himself, and it's on record, he said that the guy who hit him said, "I wouldn't have hit him if you hadn't come for me."
And afterwards, one of the men, when he was lying on the grass, he said, "If you hadn't to grapple with me, I wouldn't have hit you."
But you felt you had to?
Well, I wanted to save my train if possible. I thought there was only 2 bandits. And now, of course, they're no different.
Okay, it's still a brutal attack, but it's not the attack that people have said where people were bloodily coshed all over the place. I don't expect to get a good press out of that particular interest, and of course we never did and never will.
I watched him go down from a big strong man.
Jack Mills' son, John, speaking in 1993.
I blamed him, but he didn't die. I'd never heard Dad say a word against him.
The trial lasted 51 days. There were 613 exhibits, with testimony from 264 witnesses. An estimated 2.5 million words were recorded in court. The sentences that Justice Edmund Davis finally delivered were staggering. The 11 men were sentenced to a total of 307 years, with most of them receiving 30 years each.
Most of us who've been with the story for a long time were very surprised. In fact, the barristers, the lawyers were surprised. A shockwave, I know it's a cliché, but a shockwave ran through that ancient courtroom in the town square in Aylesbury. The train robbers, they came out sort of top of the Premier Division. Their sentences were almost unprecedented.
Bobby Welsh, Gordon Goody and Tommy Wisby.
When I saw the local dignitaries with their wives and all their finery, you know, this was what they've all come to watch. This was the climax of the play, the drama. The medieval settings in which we were sentenced, you know, it was a bit chilling.
We thought when we went away we were never coming out. That's how I felt anyway. There's plenty of people who said, well, he's dead now. He'll never come out, you know, after a sentence like that, because in those days there was no parole, you see.
When I turned round, the flying squad was at the back. And one went to me, pointed at me and went, you'll come out in a wheelchair.
Why did the robbers receive such harsh sentences, do you think?
This was the first time that the British establishment had been made to look vulnerable and foolish by street criminals. For a group of criminals to put themselves together in an organised way, obtain high-level, valuable intelligence about the movement of, let's face it, it's the government's money, and then to pull off a robbery so daring, it was seen to be that they had to make an example of them. But, you know, everyone talks about 30 years, but in reality they actually served about 11 years.
But at the time of the sentencing, there wasn't the parole system. So at the time that they were sentenced, it could have meant 30 years.
Well, in which case then it had the impact on anybody else that was thinking of carrying out such an organised, well-rehearsed crime that maybe it ain't going to be worth it. Might also have had the effect of saying, well, if you're going to go and do it, you might as well go armed, because you won't get any more if you kill somebody.
But the sentences were so shocking that they perhaps had the effect of stirring further public sympathy for the robbers. Bruce Reynolds.
They could recognise the truth in that dictum that a free spirit gives hope to the oppressed. When you've got all the problems in the world, when you're working and you've got a mortgage and you've got children, and you think, well, how lovely it would be, you know, to rob a train and go and live in the south of France. There's a magic word called escape.
From Winson Green Jail the other day, one of the train robbers escaped. How Charles Wilson was told when he'd be sprung, we don't yet know. However, it's one thing to get over the wall, quite another to stay free.
Which side are you on, the escaper or the police who are trying to catch him?
I like to encourage the police, but I think the escape, I like him to have a good run for his money.
The story of the great train robbers wouldn't go away.
If I saw him in the street, I should be very tempted to go to the police straight away, because that would give me a chance of personal glory, I think, because it would get my name in the papers, and this, I think, is one of the ideals of everyday men.
I think it's dreadful. I think thieves ought to get what's coming to them. Besides, I'm a policeman's wife.
Do you think the public as a whole tends to identify with the escaper rather than with the police?
Yes, I would think that we do, if I may speak for the public.
Almost a year later, Ronnie Biggs made a spectacular jailbreak from Wandsworth Prison.
So grandiose had become the stories about the great train robbers and their heroism that, in fact, the Chief Constable of Durham spoke about the possibility of tactical nuclear weapons being used by their accomplices in order to free them from the maximum security wing at Durham Prison. And there were stories of policemen with Geiger counters lying in the ditches which flanked the A1. There was such a paranoia. After all, Biggs had escaped, and Wilson had escaped previously. All of a sudden, these people were getting over the wall. The idea that there was a massive group of highly intelligent, well-planned criminals who could do what they liked in our country grew apace.
These two escapes meant that...
The others is Bruce Reynolds, the leader of the robbers. 5 times the police have questioned this man. Each time he's been able to prove that however much he resembles Reynolds, he is in fact Noel Botham, freelance journalist.
Bruce Reynolds had escaped to Mexico.
I really did think that I would get away with it. I mean, I suppose I had something like £100,000 left to play with.
Did you have any regrets about the fact that you'd imposed this sort of fugitive lifestyle on your family?
My wife Angela was with me all the way.
I was with him all the way. I didn't have any opinion as to whether it was a good thing or a bad thing.
Angela Reynolds, interviewed in 1995.
That was Bruce. I was proud of him. I knew him to be a very ambitious person, and I felt I wanted to share that with him.
In actual fact, it became much more difficult when Buster came to Mexico.
What finally made you decide to go to Mexico?
The police advised me that I should go away for about 5 years and forget any sort of deals, and then perhaps after 5 years I could come home and have a deal with the police.
The police actually suggested you should go away?
When he decided he was going to go back home and face the music, when a deal had been worked out for him, I knew then that my security had been breached.
When you came back to England, you started to commit more robberies. Why did you do that? What was your plan?
We'd been living at the rate, I mean, I had an ex-president's penthouse. We were living like the 5% of the top people in Mexico City. It then become a thing of, well, you know, I've got to survive. So then it was a question of going back, as I'm saying, getting the books out again on old robberies.
Under the assumed name of Keith Hiller, Bruce Reynolds and his family moved to a modest-sized house in Torquay. It was a risky move, to put it lightly. On the night of November the 7th, 1968, Bruce was driving home with a crate of champagne, which he had stolen from a house in Kent. Little did he know that Tommy Butler of the flying squad was very close.
I rang Angela to say I was on my way home, said I'll be home in about half hour, run me a bath. I got some nice crate of champagne, we'll have a nice drink. And next morning, I heard the doorbell go. Of course, they come in and more or less jumped on me and held my arms like this, and Butler said, you know, I've got you, Bruce, you know. So I remember saying, c'est la vie.
Bruce pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years. He was the last member of the gang to be arrested for the Great Train robbery. By this time, all of the robbers that were known about were in prison. Save one.
The search for train robber Ronald Biggs is organised from the headquarters of the Victoria Police in Melbourne.
Ronnie Biggs, with his wife Charmian and their 2 sons, fled to Australia, where he lived peacefully for almost 4 years. But the police eventually caught up with him in Melbourne, though yet again Ronnie was able to evade capture and flee to Brazil. After several years in Rio, Ronnie was running out of money, and like Buster, was contemplating a return to the UK with a deal for a reduced sentence. Ronnie confided this intention with a Russian friend of his, Konstantin Benkendorf, who on his return to Britain bumped into a journalist at a cocktail party.
And he said, my goodness, he said, I've got a story that would interest you. And before he could finish his sentence, I said, you bumped into Ronnie Biggs, didn't you? And he went absolutely crimson. And I had one of those hallelujah moments where I knew I'd hit the nail on the head, and this was going to be a life-changing story.
Express journalist Colin Mackenzie called Biggs and confirmed the story. It was absolute tabloid gold dust. Colin was eventually summoned to the editor's office.
Before I could open my mouth, I was informed I was to be taken down to Scotland Yard and to cooperate fully with a gentleman called Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Slipper. I was utterly shocked because I had made a deal with Biggs over the telephone, first of all to give him a sum of money, and secondly that he was going to give himself up and come back voluntarily.
Colin flew out to Rio, shadowed by Scotland Yard. Met Ronnie on the 30th of January 1974, and with a photographer spent a day with him around Rio. On the morning of February the 1st, he arranged to meet him again for another interview at the Hotel Trocadero. Can you describe the moment when the police arrived?
Well, it was horrific. I had the tape recorder out. Biggs was with this girlfriend, Lucia, who was to disappear from the story. Bill Lovelace, my photographer, was taking pictures of him and Lucia on the bed. And my heart was racing, as you can imagine, at about 200 beats a minute. And there was duly a knock on the door. Jack Slipper walked in and said words, Ronnie Biggs, long time no see. I'll never forget them.
The way the situation has often been portrayed was that you put the finger on Ronnie Biggs. You deny that.
I didn't put the finger on him myself. Events were taken out of my hands the minute that Ian McColl alerted the Metropolitan Police to the existence of the story.
For Ronnie Biggs, the tabloid deception still rankles, as I learnt during my visit to his care home earlier this year. You know, when the Daily Express did the story in Rio, how did you feel about that? Do you feel that you were betrayed by them? B, Y, by, C, I, N, Colin, was it? Was that the name of Colin Mackenzie, yeah? So how do you feel about him, about what happened? You feel angry? You feel angry towards Colin Mackenzie? He was actually most animated when he talked about this incident. He was quite clear that he's still very angry with you. Do you think the scoop was worth all this?
I certainly regret enormously letting him down in the sense that he wasn't able to voluntarily give himself up, which is the understanding I had he would be prepared to do under the circumstances. Of course, once Scotland Yard put their hand on his shoulder, he changed his mind. And I was instrumental in getting him a good and very expensive lawyer in Brazil who secured him his freedom.
Do you think you were set up by the Express? But some people would say that they were, because you were a fugitive from Her Majesty's government, that they were only doing their duty. Bollocks. For the listeners, there is a word that Ron has on one of his alphabet boards that is bollocks. B-A-L-L-S. Balls.
Until Superintendent Jack Slipper and Sergeant Peter Jones arrived in Rio de Janeiro last Friday, Ronald Biggs had been living a remarkably quiet and settled life in this noisy, bustling, tourist-crammed city.
John Humphreys reported the Biggs arrest for the BBC.
One of Biggs' neighbours told me everyone liked him a lot. A quiet, kind man, she said, a real finou, Portuguese for a gentleman. Biggs has become, in a small way, a bit of a hero to some Brazilians. An apparently reformed criminal leading a fairly useful life, who should perhaps just be left alone to carry on the way he's been going for the last few years. But as Superintendent Slipper says, his was the crime of the century in Britain, and he had to be recaptured, if only as a deterrent to others.
But of course he wasn't recaptured. Biggs' long-term girlfriend Raimunda was pregnant with his child, so the Brazilians refused to extradite him. Slipper was forced to return to London empty-handed.
He was an attractive individual. He was 6'2", blue-eyed, had a nice manner about him, could always tell a funny story, and he was able to conduct his life being a tourist attraction and being a celebrity, and it was a lot better than serving time in Wandsworth Jail, where he'd been in 1965.
In 1978, when Johnny Rotten left the Sex Pistols, their manager Malcolm McLaren briefly used Ronnie Biggs as a replacement vocalist. The song No One Is Innocent appeared in the film The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, the title of course borrowed from the Great Train Robbery. I was a punk back then, and to be honest, we were a bit underwhelmed. But long before the Sex Pistols film, The Great Train Robbery and its characters have had countless references in British cinematic culture. In the 1965 Bond film, Thunderball, it's claimed that the global terrorist organisation Spectre helped mastermind the robbery.
Number 5. Our consultation fee for the British train robbery, £250,000.
Turnover!
From spy thriller to gritty realism.
Right, action!
One of the first films to directly fictionalise the robbery was the 1967 film Robbery, directed by Peter Yates.
This is one of the great luxuries of this. And anyone says, oh no, you'll never get away with that, you can always say, well, they did.
Stanley Baker is the co-producer of the film, and he's starring in it as leader of the gang.
Well, I'm not defending it.
Well, are you glamorising it?
Oh, certainly not, no. Why should one glamorise it?
And The Great Train Robbery inspires the classic caper movie. Could even inspire a romantic comedy.
Buster, don't go.
The 1988 film, Buster, starred Phil Collins as the eponymous hero. The robbery was now rendered as a bizarre love story.
Most men would have throttled their old ladies by now. You want to know why I haven't? Because you are the best bloody thing that's ever happened to me.
One of that film's taglines was Buster, charming, lovable, and wanted for the crime of the century. The story of the Great Train Robbery is repeated, reimagined, and reassessed over and over again. And the robbers themselves appear frozen in an era when crime was so different from what it is today. Laurie Taylor.
criminals now aren't robbing banks or robbing trains. Why should you bother to go and get shooters and fix signals on trains and hire people who can move a train along and cost guards and have a farm? Why bother with all that when, in fact, you can make as much money selling coke in 6 months across London and, in fact, have to go through none of those extravagant, heroic gestures in order to move it around. Perhaps one of the reasons why we still like the Great Train Robbery is it was the time when crime actually looked exciting, when exciting things happened. It's difficult to have an heroic drug dealer, really, isn't it?
And in the long run, the reality of the lives of those involved has never been that glamorous. In the end, the legacy of a crime becomes a curse for the criminals. After escaping from prison, 4 years on the run in Canada and serving another decade in prison, Charlie Wilson was shot dead on the Costa del Sol in 1990.
Charles Wilson was murdered in the garden of his villa at the smartest resort on what's been called Spain's Costa del Crime. Spanish police haven't ruled out that Wilson's killing was the settling of an old score from the robbery 27 years ago.
Unlike the happy ending of the film, the real life of Buster Edwards ended tragically in 1994.
This week, Buster Edwards was found dead, having apparently committed suicide in a lock-up garage near the flower stall he ran in Waterloo, South London. In the Daily Express, he was the convict-turned-folk hero. But the Daily Mail called him a vicious villain, and the Telegraph's deputy editor, Simon Heffer, told his readers why Buster would not be appearing in his paper's obituary pages.
After he was captured, Bruce Reynolds served almost 10 years in prison.
There were periods where I'd have cheerfully said, I don't want to be on parole, I much prefer to be in prison, which is not surprising, really, considering I'd been away for 9.5 years, and all the outside world, had gone.
In 1995, Bruce came back into the limelight with the publication of his highly praised memoir, The Autobiography of a Thief. How would you justify this to people who would criticise the fact that they would say you were making money out of your nefarious past?
I've tried to be as honest as I can. It's the story, the train robbery, and the effects it had upon the participants and their families. Our families, due to our own selfishness, were just as much victims as Jack Mills was.
Bruce talks about his broken family past, that you actually didn't end up in prison.
Yeah.
How do you credit that? Because, as I say, statistically it's so common.
It's very common if your father's a criminal for you to follow in his footsteps.
Nick Reynolds.
He'd done what he'd said was the equivalent of his Sistine Chapel, and I just thought, well, I'd seen the highs and I'd seen the lows. And I think not only that, I didn't want to let my dad down, really. I think it was very important to him that I made my own way in life and didn't follow him and make the same mistakes that he had done. And so I went the other way.
When you get old, you start to, instead of seeing things in black and white, you increasingly things in so many shades of grey, and I don't consider I'm someone that people should admire for their criminal activities, but nevertheless, that's what I did. I'm not ashamed of it, I did it.
The interview I recorded with Bruce Reynolds turned out to be his last. He died a few weeks later on the 28th of February, 2013. Neither Bruce nor Ronnie Biggs was paid for these interviews. Ronnie Biggs is one of the handful of train robbers still around for the 50th anniversary. Here he is, interviewed by the BBC in 1997.
I don't regret the fact that I was involved in the train robbery, and as a matter of fact, I'm quite pleased with the idea that I was involved in it.
Why?
Well, because it's given me a little place in history, shall we say. I've made a mark for myself.
It's ironic that the last person to get involved in the robbery, and one who only made a minor contribution to it, became the most famous of them all. In 1998 and 99, Ronnie suffered 3 strokes, which left him without speech. In 2001, he finally decided to give himself up.
The train robber Ronnie Biggs is back in jail in Britain after 35 years on the run. The Press Complaints Commission is to investigate the Sun newspaper's part in bringing him back.
This wasn't the Ronnie Biggs of old, the playboy with the champagne lifestyle. This was an elderly, sick man.
It's thought that, along with rising medical costs and outstanding debts, were a factor in his decision to turn to a national newspaper.
Ronnie Biggs is still in his care home in Barnet, North London. Why did he come back to Britain, Ron? One's pointing to his wrist. Ghostwriter Chris Pickard.
So he tried to commit suicide in Brazil. He'd got to that point of being that low, where he realised he was a burden to the family.
So you felt that desperate, yeah? One's showing me the marks on his wrist. Was it also because you felt you'd get better care in your old age here than in Rio? No? Do you think you are being looked after well here? Yes. Ronnie came back to Britain and served almost 7 years in prison. He was released in 2008 by Justice Secretary Jack Straw on compassionate grounds. Perhaps part of the media's attraction to him was the fact that he was a seemingly ordinary guy caught up in something really big. His fugitive status made him a wanted man, and I feel, despite his less than glamorous surroundings, he still likes the attention. Do you ever feel that you were going to get away with it? Yes. Do you think you did get away with it? Yes. It said that during the time that you were counting the money, Gordon Goody started singing The Good Life. And it seems that everybody involved in this was after The Good Life. Did you ever find The Good Life? In Rio? Yeah? Was Rio the good life for you? Yeah? F-U-N, fun? Did you ever find the good life, Bruce?
I got what I wanted in life, what I considered a good life. And I wanted to lead a life like Hemingway. When I was in Mexico, you know, the people I knew were bullfighters and motor racing drivers. And when you're in a position you can do anything you want to do, it no longer has quite the same attraction. You realise that it's all tinsel to a degree.
So ironically, after all this time, you found that an austere life could be as happy as this good life.
I only ever wanted to live in a place I felt comfortable in, which is, ironically, I suppose, about the size of a cell.
Probably the next question, Ron, is do you have any regrets? I-L-O-S-T, lost, I lost. M-Y, my, W-I-F, my wife, I lost my wife. And also the family in Australia. What does the Great Train Robbery mean now? Does it mean anything anymore? No. Do you think times have changed so much? Yes. So how do you think history will see the Great Train Robbery? What word will they use to describe this? D-A-R-I-N-G. Daring.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.